I am the BBC State Department correspondent in Washington, and I've been there for the last 5 years, and I travel around the world with the American Secretary of State. I did it first for 1 year with Condoleezza Rice, then for 4 years with Hillary Clinton, and more recently, of course, with John Kerry. But before becoming a State Department correspondent for the BBC, I was living in Beirut. I was born there. I am a child of war. I was born in 1977 in Beirut on the front lines, and I lived with my family on the front lines of that civil war. And perhaps you, if you're not too young, then you remember the images of the civil war in Beirut from 1977 to 1990. If you're trying to imagine what it's like to live on the front lines of a civil war, the way I did in Beirut, or the way some people are doing now in Syria, of course, think of a no man's land with overgrown vegetation because it's been completely abandoned, bombed out buildings, refugees squatting in empty houses, soldiers or militiamen hanging out downstairs on the street. So when you go out and play, you're playing hopscotch on the street, but there are armed gunmen nearby, and your parents have to, let you out a little bit because you need to, see daylight. But they're also very concerned about what might happen to you if you stay outside too long. And on the third floor of one building is where we lived, and I have very vivid images still to this day, even though I was very, very young when this was all taking place. I have very vivid images of what it was like to be there. The war is very much part of me. It has never left me, even though I left Lebanon 5 years ago. I lived in Beirut my whole life for 30 years until I moved to Washington 5 years ago. So it really becomes part of who you are. And although war is, really nothing to be, living through war is nothing to be thankful for, it did make me who I am. It did make me who I am, and I never forget where I'm coming from, because it does help me bring a certain distinctive aspect or distinctive angle to my writing and my reporting. Because I remembered as an adult that when I was younger, my father always said, if America wanted the war to end, it would be over tomorrow. And how many times have we not heard this? Even in Europe, where you have perhaps a more realistic perception of the limits and the possibilities of America's power. But there are still moments, and I even get it from Dutch diplomats sometimes. If the Americans wanted it, it would happen. If the Americans had a plan, or what is the plan? These questions haunted me as a child. We waited for 15 years for this war to end. 150,000 people died. I don't know how we escaped unscathed from that war. It was nothing short of a miracle, because we really did live in one of the worst neighborhoods of Beirut, and I will have a discussion one day with my parents about why they decided to stay there. But that's where we were, perhaps because we just didn't know where else to go, because we didn't know whether somewhere else it would be safer or better, perhaps because we thought, it can't get worse than this, and somehow it always did until the war ended in 1990. But while we were waiting, one of the questions was, why isn't the US doing more? Why isn't the US just pressing a button and making it all stop? Did it not have the power to do so? Did it not want to do that? Or perhaps this was all part of some plan that we were just a pawn in, that was part of a big strategic geopolitical play between the US and Russia at the time, which was the other superpower, of course, in the 80s. And I have this very vivid image that a lot of people in Lebanon have as well, and no doubt today in places like Syria as well, of leaders sitting in a room and deciding of people's fates, pinning, little post-its on a map, deciding who was going to get which part of Lebanon, and who was going to get the spoils of war. Because when you live in chaos, when you live in war, and you have no power to do anything about it, you try to make sense of what is going on around you by ascribing bigger powers to someone else. Some people turn to God, and some people, as one person on Twitter sent me a message once, some people turn to America. America, why aren't you helping? Why aren't you doing something? And if there isn't a solution, then if I don't have the solution, then the solution is perhaps with the United States. But my constant desire, my constant quest to understand what was going on around me, all the questions I got as well when I came to the Netherlands, because we did come here for the summer to escape the war in Lebanon. We tried as much as we can. Whenever we could leave the country, we would come to the Netherlands to spend the summer. I got a lot of questions about what life was like in Lebanon. And I was also trying to understand why I had to live the way I was living. Why was there such a difference between the life I had in Beirut and the life that my cousins had here in the Netherlands? I was, quite mature politically from a young age, and that's, I think, part of what happens when you, aren't just able to play on the streets, and when your life is dictated by curfews and shelling and snipers. So I decided at the very young age of 13 to become a journalist. And I never let go of that plan. You see, sometimes plans do work out, but sometimes not exactly in the same fashion as you had initially anticipated. The route that I took to become a journalist was not the one I had envisaged when I was a child, but eventually I still got there. And I started in Beirut working for local media, working for the Volkskrant. I wrote for them for 5 years. Don't worry, I did not make them correct my Dutch repeatedly. My Dutch never was good enough to write because I never learned how to write it. I really only spoke it at home. So they were kind enough and eager enough to have my reporting that they would translate the articles from English to Dutch. And I could read enough Dutch that I could tell that nothing was indeed being lost in translation. So I was a reporter in Beirut. I then also started working for the BBC until one day in January of 2008, I applied for the BBC State Department correspondent job in Washington, and I got it. Now, when I was young, I really never for once imagined that one day I would be in Washington covering the State Department and would be able to put some of those questions that haunted me as a child to the American Secretary of State. Not only that, but I would even fly back to Beirut on the plane of the Secretary of State herself. At the time, it was Hillary Clinton. I'd covered the State Department for a year under Condoleezza Rice, and then Hillary Clinton came into office at the beginning of 2009. And in April of 2009, I traveled to Beirut with her. We went to Iraq, and then we went to Beirut, and there was a lot of security surrounding that visit. There was a lot of secrecy because Beirut, as of course you know, not just because of the war, but also because of the attacks against American interests in Beirut during the war, the embassy bombing, the Marine barracks bombing. There is a lot of security that is required to protect American diplomats in Lebanon. So I couldn't even tell my family that I was coming. There was absolute secrecy. I couldn't tell anyone. And it took me a while to realize what a powerful moment this was, that I was a child of war, growing up in Beirut, becoming a journalist, then going to Washington, you know, the capital of the superpower, that caused me so much angst when I was a child, and then flying back to Beirut, my hometown, on the plane of, you know, admittedly one of the most powerful global politicians. It was also very weird because when I was in Beirut as a citizen, you know, I would drive around the city, and I was just, you know, talking to Bas about how there are no rules in Beirut. You know, you don't stop at traffic lights, you don't stop for stop signs, you just do whatever you want. But you do have to stop for American embassy motorcades. They block off the streets, they have a lot of security, and for a long time, up until about the mid-90s, or perhaps even the late 90s, if I'm not mistaken, they also drove around with big cars, big sort of SUVs with machine guns on a turret on top of on top of the roof of the car. So you can just imagine the scene in Beirut. You're going along, going to, I don't know how many of you have been to Beirut, but it's a pretty cosmopolitan city. So, you're driving, you're going to get your croissant, your cappuccino, and there comes, the American ambassador, all sirens wailing, everybody to the side. And it's really very irritating. And I think, you've been perhaps posted abroad already in countries where you've seen that happen as well. Everything stops for the American ambassador. They live in a big fortress, retrenched from the world. They have a lot of protection. But now, all of a sudden, hey, I was in the motorcade. I was with the Secretary of State, and everybody had to, get out of the way for me. Well, not for me, but, for the Secretary of State. It was just such an intense moment where I felt both at home but a stranger. I felt alien but familiar. And that's when I realized that I was really in a unique position. I had those two lives, and they had intersected right there in this moment in Beirut. My life as a child of war, as a Lebanese citizen, as a Lebanese journalist, and my life as a foreign correspondent in Washington. And that's when the idea of the book started coming to my mind. It took a long time still before I decided to write the book, but I started thinking that I had a different story to tell, because some of my colleagues from the State Department press corps, I don't know how much you know actually about how the Secretary of State travels, but it's quite different from most other foreign ministers. She has her own plane, a large staff, 40 people, and a plane that is assigned to her at any time she needs it. I know some countries charter planes or they have private jets, depending on how big the delegation is. They have government planes. But with the American Secretary of State, it's a big Boeing 757, and she can take about 13 to 15 journalists with her. And we're part of a small group, and we always travel with her, so you get to know her quite well. You're not on every trip, but almost if you want to. And as they say, if you really want to get to know someone, you better travel with them. So I was traveling with this group of journalists, and they started asking me questions about me, about how it felt like to be in Beirut, about what it felt like to cover the Secretary of State. And they started asking me questions about what Lebanon was really like, what Hezbollah's role really was, how things would play out after the elections. And so it was this moment that where it started crystallizing in my head that there was something there that I could contribute to the conversation about American power, about what America meant for countries like Lebanon, but also for other countries. Because wherever I went with Hillary Clinton, and I'd been on a few trips already with her, and of course with Condoleezza Rice as well, I found that I was faced with the same questions that haunted me as a child. The world has changed a lot. And the conversation about American decline is cyclical and keeps coming back. But questions about America remain. How much power does it have? What can it do? What can it do for me? Why is it behaving like this and not like that? Whether it was in Pakistan or China or even in Europe. So I had these echoes from my childhood that were coming back to me as I was traveling with the Secretary of State. And of course, when you talk about decline, you're also wondering, if America is in decline, what will replace it? If China is the only superpower tomorrow, what would the world look like? So the book started taking on a sort of quite a serious tone. But then I was in The Hague one day at the end of 2009, and I was having a brunch with some of my dear Dutch friends, some of whom are your colleagues, Dutch diplomats, and they started asking me, but what is it like on the plane with her? What is she like? What do you eat? Do they book the hotels for you? How do you stay awake? What about the jet lag? And I started thinking, okay, that's really interesting. So even other diplomats are still fascinated by those gossipy details, but also by those details that tell you something about what kind of power America is in the 21st century, because it is really all in the details. Her plane is not exactly new, it's not exactly comfortable, it's not glamorous, and the food isn't great. So, it contrasts a little bit with the image that I had as a child of an omnipotent superpower. So that's when I thought, okay, there is a book there to write. that not only discusses the bigger topic of American power, but also takes the reader with me on a journey. I really wanted this book to be accessible to a wide audience. So even as a diplomat, don't worry, I won't tell anyone. You may not be reading, big political books every day. You sometimes want to, have a lighter read as well, a novel or a love story. So what I do in The Secretary, as it's called in English, in Dutch it's Op reis met Hillary Clinton. What I do is really take the reader along with me to show them, rather than tell them, what it's really like on the inside, what it's really like for America to be a superpower today. Because you may think that it's easy. When you're a superpower, you can do whatever you want, but actually it's quite difficult. And I was quite impressed when even the Turkish foreign minister once, when I interviewed him, acknowledged that it looked easy from afar, but the more he spoke to Hillary Clinton, the more he realized that being a superpower is actually quite complex, because if you're a country like Turkey or another small power or another small country, you don't have to think about every single issue in the world. You can focus on the issues that are relevant to you, but the US doesn't have that luxury. It needs to think about everything at the same time. So the book has 3 layers. It has a bit of my own perspective, because that's what I bring to the discussion. It has, of course, the discussion about American power. And it has, of course, Hillary Clinton as the key central character. And I will get to that point at the end. Because I may be wrong, but as diplomats, perhaps you are more interested still in the details of the foreign policy discussion. But I would be happy to answer questions about Clinton herself and what sort of person she's like. But what really struck me in a lot of those travels and a lot of the discussions I had with people about the United States is the continued fascination that people have with the United States, whether they like it or whether they don't like American power, whether they resent it or whether they welcome it. And I was very struck when your own Prime Minister Rutte, came to the US in November 2011, and sitting there in the White House in the Oval Office, President Obama said, "We have no better friend than the Netherlands." And of course, when you're Dutch, you think that's great. We love to hear that. Music to our ears. I don't want to disappoint you too much, and perhaps you've seen that before, but there is a wonderful little montage done by the Danish television, where they put next to each other all the times that an American official has said exactly that to one of America's allies. We have no better friend than. We have no better partner than. And it could be Italy or Japan or South Korea or France or Canada, or of course the Netherlands. And of course, if you're British, you're very special. It's the special relationship. And everybody wants to hear that from the United States. Everybody's concerned about whether they're still America's best friend, about whether they still have a special connection with the United States. So it's a nice position to be in as a superpower, because when you contrast that to China as a superpower, because it is a superpower, even if it's not, even if it's number 2, China is quite lonely as a superpower. It doesn't have that many friends. It has a lot of trade partners, a lot of business deals everywhere. It has a big army or military, but it doesn't have a lot of people who are desperate to hear that China is indeed their best friend. But the position of the US, as I'm sure you're fully aware, is also being challenged on a daily basis as a superpower. It is not the only superpower anymore. It is still the largest. But it is not a position that it can just maintain without doing anything anymore. It needs to work at it constantly. And particularly when you think back to 2008, it's easy to forget today that in 2008, the conversation about American decline had really reached a peak. There was the financial crisis of 2008. There was 8 years of the Bush administration, where diplomacy was, not exactly a priority. Whatever you thought of President Bush's policies, they did make they did have a negative impact on America's credibility. So when Clinton and Obama came to Washington, when President Obama went to the White House and Hillary Clinton went to the State Department, they really felt that something had to be done to both address the perception of the United States around the world, but also find new ways for the US to be relevant in the 21st century in a world where there are countries like Turkey and Brazil, but also, of course, China, South Africa, and India, that all want to have a say on the global stage. Of course, you also have other powers, small and big, the EU, the Netherlands, the British, but there's this new sort of class of powers that want to have a bigger role on the world stage. I'll start with perceptions. Perceptions of the US are quite important, because when you are resented more than you are loved, then it's quite difficult to do business around the world. And Clinton felt very much that it was important to focus on public diplomacy, not just meeting with leaders, but also meeting with people, people-to-people diplomacy. Because in this day and age, as we've all seen, the power of people has quite a big impact. It's always been there. We've seen it here in Europe and Eastern Europe, but never before has power been so diffuse, so difficult to maintain, so difficult to exercise, and never before has the power of people had such a big impact on policies made or taken by leaders. So Clinton felt very much that it was important to connect with people everywhere, and she was the State Department's best asset because she came with a built-in global stature, with built-in celebrity. Now, of course, when she came to the Netherlands on her first trip to The Hague in 2009, or when she went to the UK, it was all easy. It was a love fest. Everybody loved her. Everybody clapped. Everybody thought she was fantastic. But there are countries where it's a little bit more difficult, like Pakistan. She decided that even though Pakistan had a very difficult relationship with the United States, that it was, what I call a frenemy. It's not exactly an enemy, it's not exactly a friend. You have to do business with them, but it's a very difficult relationship. There are lots of tantrums that everybody throws on, both sides of that relationship. When you're dealing with someone like that, she thought, it's just not enough anymore to only talk to the leaders. And she told her staff, make me a punching bag. Just put me out there, I will answer all the questions, I will sit with people, I will talk to students, I will sit with newspaper editors, with women, with entrepreneurs, with tribal leaders, and I will answer all the questions. And she did. And it was almost like national therapy, because you can imagine, your prime minister, your foreign minister here perhaps, does meet with people on a regular basis, or gives press conferences, or just shakes hands with people on the street. But in countries like Pakistan, it's quite rare, perhaps unheard of even, for a senior Pakistani official to take questions from a room full of students. So imagine the American Secretary of State suddenly showing up and taking questions at random from the room. Does it make a difference? Actually, it does. Because I saw the coverage in the press over the course of the 3 days that she was there. It started being very acerbic, vitriolic. And by the time she left, after she had been on her tour of charming everyone, you could see that the tone in the newspaper was a little bit less acerbic, a little bit softer. It wasn't a love fest, but she had definitely made a dent in the wall of mistrust. But she had to keep it up, and so she continued doing that with Pakistan, with other countries around the world. Everywhere she went, she always held town hall meetings, as they call them in the US, where she met with people, engaged with them, explained American foreign policy. Because the questions that I had as a child are still there today. The world is changing, but some of these questions remain. And I saw the impact that it made, but it is relentless work. And she continued doing that over 4 years in what I describe as a campaign for America. She was really out there improving perceptions, talking to people, and often in a very candid way. I found that she was very much able to, take the heat. She could be a punching bag. You could ask her tough questions, and you would get reasonably candid answers. She was very open about the fact that the US had interests and values, and that it worked to align them, but that sometimes it just wasn't possible. And when you hear that as someone living in Pakistan or Lebanon or China, you think, okay, I may not agree with that. It may suck for me as a person in wherever I'm living, but I get it. I can understand that. It's frustrating, but I can understand that. Now, the other aspect of her time in office was, of course, trying to do more with less, or perhaps as much with less, because everybody has bezuiniging, not just the Netherlands. It also happens in the US, and at quite a big pace. So how do you stay relevant as a superpower in the 21st century when you don't want to foot the whole bill, when you don't want to do everything on your own? You become what I describe, and what Walter Russell Mead actually first described, as the chairman of the board. You don't do everything on your own. You don't make all the decisions. You don't necessarily always lead very much from the front, although I'm not a fan of the expression leading from behind. I don't know whether it has crossed the Atlantic already. But you need to find new ways to work with others to get things done, like on internet freedom with the Netherlands, like counterterrorism with Turkey. So Clinton very methodically tried to apply the concept of smart power. That is diplomacy, development, and the military, and try to find new ways of connecting with everybody so that the US would be at the center of a web of connections where everybody would automatically come to the US to work with the US. And you can't do that if you haven't improved perceptions of the US. If nobody wants to work with you because they don't like you, then you can't implement the concept of smart power. So it was a little bit of a two-track approach. So instead of saying, we don't want to work with Brazil, we don't like the fact that Turkey is a rising power, we don't want to work with China, we want to remain the superpower, the only superpower, I think the US recognized that it had to change its own attitude to how the world was changing, because it simply itself wasn't willing to do everything on its own anymore. And it had to work with others, often, of course, as well, this is not a charity, for its own interests. Now, what does that look like? Well, it looks like the military intervention in Libya. In 2011, in March of 2011, the French and the British were very keen to impose a no-fly zone over Libya. The Americans, not so much. But when they saw that everybody was starting to come together, that the Arab League had called for a no-fly zone, and this administration is very keen on local, regional ownership of the issue. Don't just ask us what we can do for you. How can we help you help yourself is a little bit the attitude. When Clinton got assurances from the Qataris and the Emiratis that they would participate militarily in any intervention that would be conducted, then Clinton went back to President Obama and said, okay, I've got the French and the British on board. They understand that we need more than just a no-fly zone. They are willing to put their military hardware out there. I have the Qataris and the Emiratis. They are willing to put their mouth where their money is. They will participate militarily. And I have spoken to the Libyan opposition, and I think we can do business. The end result is that by himself, President Obama thinks, okay, we can do this. Everybody's on board. We're the chairman of the board. We're kind of choreographing things from behind, but we're not footing the whole bill, even though as the biggest military superpower, they still had to put a lot of their own hardware out there. But this is a group effort, and this was one of the successful examples of this new approach for America doing business in the 21st century. A less successful example, very unfortunately, is of course Syria. It's just not coming together there. And for the US, for a president like the United States, for a president like President Obama, who is very much reluctant to get drawn into a third war, who doesn't want to be the president who's starting wars, but wants to be the president who's winding down wars. There is a danger in his eyes that if he takes just one step, that it will be a slippery slope, and that before he knows it, America will own the problem and will be expected to solve it, perhaps even on its own. And then when it doesn't do a good job about it, then everybody will say, why the hell are you getting involved? So it's this contradictory attitude towards the United States that persists. People both want to see the US get involved, but not too much. And the reason why I talk about Syria is not just because it is a current situation, but because I think it crystallizes a phase of transition that is taking place in both America's attitude towards its own power and how much it should do on the world stage or how little, and what the rest of the world expects from the United States and how much they wanted to be involved. Because if you think back to Iraq 2003 and the terrible chaos that ensued in Baghdad afterwards and for the years following, it is quite extraordinary that 10 years later, anyone should be asking the United States to intervene in any sort of way in the Middle East. I'm not comparing the two countries, but once you take the decision to invade Iraq, there is all the aftermath. And the aftermath was a debacle, to say the least. So why does anyone think that the US could get involved in Syria and actually make things better? Well, it's perhaps because 10 years later the pendulum has swung the other way, and countries, including in the Arab world, are perhaps rediscovering that the United States is perhaps still not indispensable fully, but still very much necessary. And there is a transition that is taking place, as I mentioned, as America tries to figure out how it can do less, but with more partners, and as the world tries to understand what it wants from the United States and how it wants the United States to help, those two have to come together. And I think it was put to me very succinctly by a young Syrian activist. He said, you know, we don't want American boots on the ground. We don't want full-scale, unilateral American military intervention. We just want American leadership. We just want them to help us do what we think we need to do and what is best for our country. But that's a message that's also still not necessarily trickling down in Washington as quickly as it should be. For the president to realize or to understand that if he does go into any sort of action, and I'm not necessarily saying unilateral or full-scale military intervention, that it doesn't mean that he has to go all in. But Syria is very complex, as you all know, and it is perhaps quite difficult to replicate the example of Libya. But there are opportunities there as America's role is changing, as perceptions of the US role is changing. And I think that there is also an opportunity there to rediscover how countries can harness that change for their own interests. I mean, in the Netherlands, you have a very strong relationship with the United States. You play a key role in things like anti-piracy and Afghanistan. But there are other interests that you have as well in common. And I think very often there is a tendency to turn inward, and perhaps as diplomats you may be frustrated that your fellow compatriots aren't interested enough in foreign policy. But in this global village, when you care about issues, you have to work with others to make it happen, whether it's human rights, whether it's climate change. We won't get into the debate about how little or how much the US is doing on climate change. But it is a two-way street increasingly, and it is also still an attitude that the US, as I said, has to adjust to as well. What struck me most with Clinton, and I'm going to wrap up by talking a little bit about her, is that perhaps more than others, she understood how America's role was changing and how America had to adapt to that. She was also able to acknowledge past mistakes, her own as well. I'm certainly not saying that she's flawless, but she is able to learn. She does have the ability to learn. And she told me once, and I quote her in the book, in one of my 19 interviews, and I interviewed her for the book, she said, you know, this is a turning point. We understand today that we cannot change the world, but we can contribute. And we can help others help themselves. But change has to come from within. So that ties back into this concept that I was talking about of perceptions on both sides of that relationship slowly changing. Now, of course, you know, the key character in my book, the reason why perhaps many people will read the book is because it has Hillary Clinton at the heart of it. She's a fantastic, compelling character that makes this book a good read as people learn to rediscover a woman who's been in the spotlight for many, many years. And I know that The question on everybody's mind is she going to run in 2016? Now, I don't know whether perhaps some of you are thinking of one day becoming ambassador to Washington in the next, few years of the next decade, and you're wondering who you might be presenting your credentials to in the Oval Office. I would suggest that you read her latest tweet. She's on Twitter. She took to Twitter yesterday. She has more than 300,000 followers already. Unfortunately, she doesn't give us the answer about whether she's going to run or not, but her bio says something like mother, wife, former senator, former secretary of state, hair icon, pantsuit aficionado, and then it says TBD, to be determined. So keep an eye on her Twitter feed to find out whether she's going to run or not. Perhaps ask her the question yourself. Maybe she'll answer. But just in a nutshell, the woman I saw is not very different. The woman I saw in public, myself when I was there, is not very different from the woman I saw in more private moments on the plane, over dinner, over drinks. But that is because I think that as Secretary of State, she really evolved, she matured, she became very comfortable in her own skin. There will always be people who don't like her, and you don't have to like her to read the Secretary, but you will rediscover her, and that's what I tell my readers, because she is the most known, unknown, global figure, I think. But she does have the ability to rediscover herself, to improve. And she doesn't like to acknowledge that she's made mistakes, certainly not in front of you, but she will, quietly correct her course of action. And of course, when it comes to her possible candidacy, I think the key element to keep in mind is that the White House would like to make sure that a Democrat wins for a third term. It would be absolutely historic if a Democrat would win the White House for a third term. Clinton will have her own reasons why she will want to run or not. She's very flexible and pragmatic. I don't think she's decided. She will study the lay of the land and decide what's best for her, what's best for her country from her perspective, of course. But a decision will also be made within the White House about who is the best candidate to take the White House in 2016 for the Democratic Party. It could be Hillary Clinton, it could be Joe Biden. I don't think they will run against each other. But if a woman wins for the first time in history in the United States, the presidency, and if a Democrat wins as well for a third term, it will be an historic time in the US. So perhaps you should start putting Washington on your list of required outside postings. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be delighted to take any questions.